Thank you for joining me in relation to this strategic analysis for your December 23 case on NCTech. I'm going to be taking you through over the course of the next sort of 50 minutes to an hour on a full strategic analysis. What do I mean by that in relation to this particular case? Well, what we're looking to do is to employ a number of strategic planning tools and techniques to really analyze the company, both externally in the main, but also internally. And really, at the end of this particular video, what we're looking to do is to say, given our analysis, given what these tools and techniques tell us, what do we think the future holds for NCTech? In other words, what strategies will they pursue? What should they be careful about? What are the opportunities and threats, etc., etc., etc. So that's the first side of a strategic analysis. The other side, as mentioned in our previous videos, is I'm trying to put you in a position where you become more informed, broadly speaking, as an officer, consultant, employee of the company. I'm trying to put you in a position that on the day when you face these various tasks, you act as if you're in real life. Remember, as I said from the off on pre-scene video number 1, to some extent, case study exams are role play. Examiners are looking for skills. Why? Because employers are speaking to the ACCA over the last 5 to 10 years and saying that some of the employees that they employ lack some skills. So what they don't want is students who can simply learn information and regurgitate it. They want people that can do things. Remember, again, from the off pre-scene video 1, I said that case study exams are about what you can do, not what you know. So be careful about this whole area of knowledge dumping, and I'm hoping that this particular video is going to help you in that sense. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the case itself. You've had a chance to read the pre-scene information carefully. We know that it's the cloud services industry, and we know that this company, NCTech, is publicly listed. The country is Ireland. Quite an interesting area because obviously, we all have some exposure in one way, shape or form, both privately and perhaps in the office, to this particular area, cloud. Now, in terms of our approach for this particular video, we're going to base it on what we refer to as the rational model. Now, for those of you who are not sort of informed as to this particular area of strategy formulation, as mentioned within the pre-scene video series, what the rational model means very simply is that we analyze the environment and indeed the company internally, externally, using tools and techniques, and we try to establish or come up with a set of strategic options, then we choose one, and then we implement. So in essence, we're talking about, okay, what's happening now? Where is the organization in terms of its resources, competencies, etc., etc.? Where is it in terms of the environment? What's happening out there? And indeed, this business strategy, fueling the future. In other words, where do we want to be? So how are we going to get there? Let's remember that strategy, in essence, is a course of action using resources to achieve a set of corporate objectives. And this whole area of the rational model is just one approach to formulating strategy. And it's quite a long-winded approach. You'll recall from the pre-scene video series that I mentioned Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. Analysis, choice, and implementation. So the rational model is based on those 3 areas. So really, that's what we're going to do. Do remember that within the pre-scene, there is reference to this periodic assessment of the environment. In other words, the writer, the examiner, tells us that NCTech and the board, and indeed their strategic planning team, use some form of set of tools and techniques to analyze the environment. So it's highly likely this is their approach. Okay, let's move on. Now, in terms of the main areas that we're going to cover within the strategic analysis, the first one is going to be mission. Now, we're familiar with that and it's referenced within the preceding. We know that's all about the purpose. Okay. Outside of that, we're going to take a quick look at the balanced scorecard. Now, don't underestimate examiners' liking for this area. When we look back on financial reporting, performance measurements, etc., over the last 30, 40, 50 years, this is one of the big areas, isn't it? Balanced scorecard, i.e. non-financial objectives, measuring areas outside of the financials. Because as businesses become more complex, as the business environment becomes more complex, we need to measure other things. So we have four main perspectives there. Outside of that, we're going to take a quick look at governance. Now, we know from the preceding video series how important governance is within the SBL exam. And for me, my experience of mock exam scripts is the students have a bit of a problem there, because there's a lot of volume in governance in the SBL syllabus. There's a lot of information, and the examiner can go anywhere with it. So, unfortunately, there's a fair degree of rote learning. We've got to know the content. Now, that doesn't mean that when we see governance or corporate governance in a question, we knowledge them. We've got to apply our knowledge. More of that later. Ethics and CSR, we know that ethics underpins the entire ACCA qualification. We also know that ethics is linked to corporate social responsibility. What do we mean by CSR? Well, for me, the simple definition is the idea that businesses like NCTech maximize the positive effect or impact of their operations and what they do on the environment, and minimize the negative effect. Okay? Now, we know within CSR, there's two main views, isn't it? There's a sort of traditional view and there's the modern view. There's sort of, against CSR and there's pro CSR. Now, CSR is not mentioned at all. And I find that a little bit unusual, because you would expect within a preceding document, certainly within other professional bodies, to have some sort of reference to what the company is doing. So really, it's an open field, but it's a nice little topic, as is ethics. Now, remember what I've said about ethics. Ethics comes up regularly, and if it does, we should be murdering it, because there's nothing to ethics. There's the mnemonic copy, there's the threats, and there's the whole area of approaching an ethical dilemma. More of that later. In terms of critical success factors, we know that's sort of referenced in the preceding when they talk about BI, business intelligence, and quantum computing, etc. But in essence, we'll take you through, or I'll take you through, several areas that clearly are important to this particular business, things that need to go right for them to have success and to achieve their corporate objectives. Next area is stakeholder analysis. Now, we know that our go-to theorist is Mendeley, okay? Now, Mendeley's matrix is simply all about prioritization. Based on that sort of four-part grid, we're looking at power and interest. Now, note that this question, or a question on stakeholders, has come up reasonably regularly. I can remember one in particular, but just a word of warning in relation to a stakeholder style question. At this level, strategic professional, we're not just going to get a question that says, list the stakeholders and tell us a little bit about what they want. He's going to have a twist to it. And the question that I remember did have a twist to it. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was a couple of years ago. So be careful when you see a stakeholder question and you answer it in a very simplistic way. If you are, you're not answering it correctly. Yes, it will be list the stakeholders. Yes, it will be what are their needs or wants. Yes, it will be what's their level of power and interest, but there'll be a twist to it. He won't hand it to you on a plate, rest assured. Okay, so outside of that, when we think about the now, what sort of tools are we going to wheel out? Well, for me, if I'm going to analyze any company, the first tool on the book has to be Porter's 5 Forces. For me, it's the most important one. Now, why is that? Well, Porter's 5 Forces is a tool that assists the user to analyze the profitability or attractiveness of a given market or industry. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. You know, does a SWOT do that? Does Porter's Diamond do that? Does Ansoff do that? No. This is a model that enables us to assess each of the 5 forces and really gauge if you're in the market, in the industry, whether or not you should stay in it, or note, if you're outside the market, whether or not you should join it. Now, in terms of using Porter's 5 forces, remember, as I've said within the preceding video series, he's never in a requirement, I think, going to signpost a model. But Porter's 5 forces has come up, but he's hidden it. And he's hidden other models. For example, there's been a question, at least 2, in fact, on Porter's Diamond. He's hidden it. He's not going to say, please wheel out Porter's 5 forces and analyze X, Y. He's not going to do that. So let's be familiar with what I say within the strategic analysis, and let's be ready for any model on the day. The models are a good way to score marks. Why? Because they give you structure. You know, if I'm wheeling out Porter's 5 forces, I've got 5 headings there. So I'm thinking, well, I'm going to intro in some way, I'm going to include in some way, and I've got 5 parts. I like having structure when I'm writing things. If I haven't got structure, it's more difficult. That's why models are useful. So let's get on to them. Outside of that, the SWOT, certainly a good model. I always like to think of the SWOT as S&W, what's good and bad now, yeah, and O and T, what would be good and bad in the future. Generally, other people would suggest that it's sort of internal and external. I agree with that, but the way I remember it is, as I've just said. Next one for us, generic strategies. Now, we know from Porter's writings that generic strategies are really Porter asking the question, how do businesses achieve competitive advantage? Think of any business. You know, how does it keep an edge, get an edge, maintain an edge, sustain an edge over its competitors? Okay, now we've got 3, or if you will, 4 main areas there. We'll slot NCTech into that model in a few minutes. Ansoff's matrix, I've mentioned this many times, and I think the reason that this particular model, Igor Ansoff's model, is so useful within case study exams is because, you know, broadly speaking, case study exams are about the future, aren't they? And businesses invariably are profit seeking. So this particular grid is an expansion model. You know, it proffers the user several options, 4 in fact, across the board, as to how to expand. In other words, how to grow revenue, how to make more money. That's why it's so useful in a case study analysis. In terms of methods of growth, we know under the banner of Ansoff's matrix that there's basically 4. Now, do remember, as I've said, if we're using Ansoff's matrix in the exam, remember, we've got to be talking about risk. And for me, in terms of the order, there's a particular order when we go from market penetration, low-end risk, all the way through to diversification. More of that later. Outside of that, when we get to, or towards the end, we're going to be talking about, well, strategy. Remember what I said from the off. What we're trying to do here is to use a set of tools and techniques, yeah, in terms of the now, yeah, to analyze the environment. Yeah. Once we've analyzed the environment and analyzed ourselves internally, we're looking to define business strategy going forward. We're looking to come up with a set of strategic options. Remember Johnson, Scholes, and Whittington. Analysis first, then choice, then implementation, and then really a loop back round. Okay? So that's where we'll get to, or that's where we're heading for, as it were, strategies going forward. Okay, I hope that that makes sense. Let's kick off. So in terms of the mission, you saw, or we saw from the pre-scene, that this idea of purpose is relevant to any company. And you know, if I pulled through this slide, one of the things I want to draw your attention to outside of what I said within the pre-scene video series, I think it was number 2 on this, is a very common question in the SBL exam, given the stated mission and indeed the vision and values, is given the scenario in the unseen. In other words, we're presented with information on the day in the question and asked to link that into the stated objectives or values or mission. Okay? Now, the difficulty there is that, in effect, you'll be given 2 or 3 different areas, and there's areas within the question and the scene. So you've really got to take each one and compare it to, let's say, the mission or the vision, or indeed the values. So there's a fair amount of work. So go about it in an ordered fashion. On the face of it, when we look at the pre-scene document, every pre-scene that I've ever seen, whether or not it's the last couple for SBL or the SEMA pre-scenes, invariably the mission and the vision, they're great, and they're tied closely into, obviously, the corporate objectives. You may remember that I referred to within the pre-scene videos the hierarchy. And it was the idea that if a company was just about to set up, they'd establish their mission and vision first. Then they'd go to their corporate objectives. And we drill down into goals and CSFs and KPIs, etc. So remember where everything sits in the hierarchy, with mission and vision right at the top. Okay? In terms of our next area, well, the balanced scorecard, as mentioned, is a popular exam topic across the board, particularly in case study style questions. What do we mean by it and what's the background? Well, very briefly, this video isn't a revision of the balanced scorecard by Kaplan and Norton, but essentially we're talking about non-financial stuff. We're talking about measuring areas outside of the financials. Historically, when we look back on financial reporting, financial accounting, we know that at the end of the day, we've sort of had a P&L and a balance sheet. What does that give us? Well, it sort of gives us, I guess, some profit, some details on net assets. Well, in today's modern environment, that's not good enough. So that's why Kaplan and Norton came up with this idea of looking at other perspectives, measuring other things. We need to measure, the customer area. We need to measure learning and innovation. We need to measure internal processes. So let's take a look here. The easy one to deal with is what we already know. So under the financial perspective, things really don't change. And if I was dealing with a question, this would be the first one that I deal with, subject to what the requirements of the question are. We know that the financial areas are easy to deal with, but I don't think that's where the marks would be. I think they're going to be elsewhere. So really, when we move on, when we think about the learning perspective, we're talking about, are NCTech and the board, are they going to launch new services? And it seems to me that if they don't reasonably soon, there's going to be an issue. Now, those services may be linked into PAAS or SAS, but they may not be. The bottom line is, let's measure how we do. Are we not launching any new services given the issues with the financials? That would seem a bit crazy. Outside of that, new markets. We know from our pre-scene analysis that they operate solely in foreign. There are many, many other markets out there for them to access. Outside of that, a link here into the idea of Ansoff, new innovations. How many new products or services have we launched in the last 3, 6, 9 months? And indeed, are we on top of new technologies? One of the things that I've mentioned in terms of the basic business model that they offer, IAS, is that costs fall over time. And there's reference in the pre-scene to say, obviously, that's the only business model that they've ever touched. They must change. So what's out there? Let's measure it. Moving on from there, in terms of the internal perspective, this is all about processes. And when you think about a business of this size, there are a range of processes going on a daily, minute-by-minute basis. We need to measure them. Now, in terms of the detail, that would depend on what comes up on the day in the big exam. But the bottom line is that this perspective simply says, our business is made up of a set of processes. Are they good? Are they efficient? Are they quick? How quickly does our help desk respond? How quickly do we satisfy our clients, etc., etc., etc. Final one, maybe the most important one of the other three, in terms of the number of clients and client satisfaction and repeat or recurring customers, clearly this is absolutely crucial. And the problem that I see, and I've mentioned this within the SWOT, in terms of NCTech's position, is it seems to me that there's something up. Yeah, market share is falling, gross profit is falling, revenue is falling, something's going on. So there's some issue relating to customers, absolutely, categorically, but we don't know what it is. And I would suggest to you that there's a fair chance that we're going to find out on the big day. So what could it be? Okay. Moving on from our balanced scorecard, let's take a look now into governance. Now, I've said several times across the video series so far that governance is a go-to topic. I've also said that governance is tricky for students. You can see from this slide, there's a lot of content. There's a lot of volume in governance. And I think, some of it, unfortunately, is a little bit dry. Yeah, well, we've just got to face it, everybody. There's no pain without gain. We have to be savvy with the key areas of good governance. I'm not going to, read these out to you. You know what they are. Now, for me, if I was approaching the exam now and I was thinking, do you know what? Paul's right. I don't really like governance. I sort of understand that it's the way in which companies are directed and controlled or managed and controlled, but I find it a bit dry. Listen, of course it's dry, but it's coming up. Look at the past exam papers and look at how many times he examines governance. And certainly in my experience of marking mock exam scripts, I would say that students' approach to corporate governance questions, I would say it's overly bad. I'd say it's probably in the middle. It's certainly not the worst area. But as I say, the problem, and I understand, is that there's so much volume. We've got to be clear on what good governance means. Now, just a word of caution here. Let's not get overexcited about SOX or Sarbanes-Oxley or, rules-based approach. I think, broadly speaking, we're going to be talking about the UK Corporate Governance Code or something similar to that. So let's keep it nice and simple, nice and easy. Let's be familiar with the key buzzwords across the board, independence, transparency, relations with stakeholders, etc., etc., etc. And remember that where governance is examined, as you'll see when I come on to the applied section here, where it's examined, invariably it's going to be along the lines of there's a problem. Now, it may not be the agency problem. We should be familiar with that, the old issue of agents versus principal, with the agents being the directors, the principal being the shareholders, and that whole idea of perhaps the directors acting in their own best interest, perhaps acting in the short term. That's a no-no, because the bottom line is we should be acting in a way that maximizes shareholder wealth. So, as I've said within the preceding videos, this has been examined, and it was a tricky question. I think it was an NGO of some kind, possibly a rail company, I'm not sure. But certainly it was a complicated agency question, and it involved being able to pick out from the exhibits several different agency relationships, not just one. So he's not going to hand it to you on a plate. You say, oh, well, it's the directors and the shareholders. There were 2 or 3 different relationships within this particular question. Now, in terms of the requirements in Farland, it says within the pre-scene that NCTech are fully compliant with the corporate governance requirements in Farland. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean he's not going to examine it? Certainly not. It could be a red herring. The examiner has complete license to do what he wants on the day. So the idea that he says that they're fully compliant, I just ignore it. I'm thinking governance, corporate governance, is on my hot topic list, and I'm going to go in to the underlying syllabus and face some pain and literally learn off the key tenets of good corporate governance. In terms of a few areas, certainly we need some balance. We need diversity. They have 6 and 6 on either side, 6 on the exec side. They have 6 on the non-exec side. They've got all of the committees that you would require, including note the risk committee. So everything looks tickety-boo, but I don't buy it. Okay, quick mention on the auditing side here. I don't see audit or auditing as a big SBL topic area. We could be wrong, I could be wrong, but I don't really see it. I haven't seen it too much. I mean, we know what the auditing is, we know what the auditors are doing, we know what their requirement is, i.e. true and fair, etc., etc. So, moving on from there, in terms of the committees, we know that the committees are in play, all four. We know the composition, etc. Okay, just a question there in terms of good corporate governance or not. Not too much mention of detail apart from the board structure and the committees, but again, he would be bringing that in on the day. One key point there I would say is that there is reference within the pre-scene to the board structure not changing for 5 years. That for me would be a little bit odd, but then if it's in line with CG practice within Farland, then it's okay. But for me, we need fresh meat, don't we? We need fresh meat on the board, whatever that means. Okay. Moving on from there, let's take a quick look at our next area. Now remember, I've flagged this several times, and the reason I flag it is not that I'm 1000% sure it's coming up. It's more that if it does, we'll murder it if we're prepared, unlike some of the other areas. So when I compare ethics and CSR, say, to governance, murdering governance questions is a lot more tricky than murdering ethics and CSR questions. In terms of issues, really the obvious ones, the bottom line with responsible employers like NCTech, although these areas aren't mentioned in the pre-scene, is that, they need to be fair. Ethics is about the difference between right and wrong. When we think of these areas, when we think of the staff, when we think of safety, when we think of stakeholders, when we think of use of data, the bottom line is they need to be fair in their business practices. And obviously, we link ethics with CSR. And I've touched on this already. We know the definition. And broadly speaking, across all professional bodies, including the ACCA, is examiners want you to be savvy with a pro-CSR stance, and savvy with the benefits of being pro-CSR. And when I think of that phrase, CSR, corporate social responsibility, I always think of the word attractiveness. Yeah? If you're pro-CSR, think of yourself as a company of being more attractive. To who? To everyone. To clients, to regulatory bodies, to investors, to employees. You become more attractive. And there were many, many studies done in the 1990s when CSR became sort of more popular and more companies were taking it up. But the whole argument is, or indeed was, that if you're pro-CSR, there's costs attached. If you're trying to be a good corporate citizen, if you're trying to look after the local community, if you're trying to look after the environment, if you're trying to cut your emissions, if you're trying to monitor your waste, there are costs attached. So the counter argument, as you know, and I know that this is very simplistic, the counter argument is Friedman. In other words, the business of business is business. You'll be familiar with that Friedman quote. So Friedman is basically saying that businesses exist to make profit. So I know that's quite simplistic, but let's be aware of both sides of the argument and to argue pro-CSR. And going back to the sort of empirical studies in the 1990s, it was basically proven that over the course of time, over 3 to 4 to 5 years, sort of medium to long term, generally speaking, companies that were pro-CSR recovered those costs and were more profitable, more successful than companies that were anti-CSR. So in essence, when we talk about the costs associated with being CSR savvy, with being a good corporate citizen, you recover those costs, it appears, based on those studies. One more point that I've mentioned within the pre-scene videos is the theorists underlying this area. Not so much in ethics, because we know what underlies ethics, the code, etc. Watch out or look up the key theorists here. I'm talking about Johnson, Scholes and Whittington, short-term shareholder interest, long-term, shaper society, etc. And also Carroll, Yeah, Carroll, this area of Carroll, what he talks about, I think it's Carroll and Buchholz actually, he talks about, or they talk about levels of social responsibility going at the bottom, economic, all the way up to philanthropic. I always like students who quote a little bit of theory. It shows that they've done their homework. Okay, let's move on from here in terms of other issues. Now, outside of what we saw up top, these would be sort of out in left field. Governance we've already covered. We know the code is relevant. Bribery, a possibility. I think what we need to do is play what we see on the pitch on the day. These are just ideas. For me, the areas up top, being fair in relation to staff, environment, community, etc., are where it's at. Okay, next one. This area of CSFs. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, I drew your attention to that area of the pre-scene where they talk about new tech, so business intelligence, AI, quantum computing, etc. And I sort of referenced the fact, just my idea, that really in the future, those will be the critical success factors. So I did say to you, if you recall within the pre-scene videos, get savvy with exactly what he said. And what he said in there is that really those areas of new tech developments are not currently available within the industry, quantum computing, business intelligence, etc. But if they were, they'd certainly be well received. So really this industry is to some extent in its infancy. It's going to change over time, and it'll change in some of those areas. So that's the first thing in relation to CSFs. The other thing, and many of these are pretty sort of generic, but they're certainly relevant to most companies. The other thing, just before I go through the slide, is you'll recall from our final video when we were looking at, KPIs, the final sort of slide. Make sure that you have a feel for that particular area of that video. And also you'll recall that I added on a couple at the end. Those are important, I think, help desk and indeed cost per customer, etc. So get familiar with the area of KPIs and indeed coming up with KPIs based on unseen information, i.e. information in the question, and coming up possibly with new critical success factors. Now, what we see on the screen are the sorts of things that you would expect. They have to have good relationships. They appear to. They need to offer quality and indeed, most importantly, reliability, given the nature of their business. They need to be efficient. They need to get back to clients. They need to deal with queries quickly. They certainly need to maintain their reputation. Why? Well, every business needs to, but the issue for me is the competition. You lose your reputation in a business like this with so many big players, of which NCTech are not one. You're in big, big trouble. Here, this is a problem. You'll see that I mentioned within weaknesses, they have a retention issue. This is absolutely critical. It appears from the pre-scene that tech know-how in this area is limited. If we've got staff heading out for competitors, that's a major, major problem. And that could affect the medium to long-term success of this business. We've got to get skilled staff and experienced staff, and we've got to keep them. Keeping them is key. Getting them is one thing. Keeping them is a problem. Okay, let's move on from there. In terms of the stakeholder analysis, now I've mentioned this already. We know that Mendeley is our go-to theorist on this area. We know that the matrix is based on power and interest, and I've just given you some ideas here. Remember that he could build in other stakeholders on the day in the unseen. Would he ask you to do an analysis? I think it's possible. He has done that, as I've said, but it'll be analysis with a twist. It's not simply going to be wheel out Paul's Mendeley's matrix grid for me, please, and I'll give you loads of marks. No. So be careful. If you're answering a stakeholder style question where you've been asked to identify stakeholders, whether or not existing, new, or more likely a combination of both, be careful if it's too easy, because there's a twist in there somewhere. Okay? So in terms of this particular grid, this prioritization grid, as it were, for me, in terms of low interest, low power, low level employees, In terms of low power, high interest, certainly management. When I say partners, I'm talking about, companies that they partner with and or suppliers. You might read 2 and 3 as being one. I'm talking about smaller players and anyone that is supplying to this particular company. So for me, certainly a low level of power, but broadly highly interested in what's going on, particularly given the circumstances, e.g. financial, staff lost, etc., that they find themselves in. If you were part of the management, would you be sitting with your feet up, drinking a cup of tea? I don't think I would be. I might be looking online for a new job and thinking, what's going to happen here? In terms of the next area, just be careful on government. What I've noticed students do is they invariably put government into key player. Yeah, that happens more often than it should. Let's be careful here. When we think about stakeholders that are low interest and high power, really the opportunity for these stakeholders to move from left to right is high. Yeah, all we need to do is something wrong. But on the face of it, as long as we stick, to the rules and regs, agreements, contractual arrangements, covenants, or whatever it is, then they're always going to be in keep satisfied. Always in keep satisfied. They don't have a high interest in what we're doing until we overstep the line. So be careful here. I've seen students, make this mistake and lose marks for no reason. Certainly government, taxes, employment law, etc., any of the regulatory bodies, and we know how important that is. It's mentioned in the pre-scene several times. And then obviously lenders and banks, although we don't know how much they're sort of leveraged, how much they're encumbered in any way to outside investors in the form of loans. We know that there are outside investors in terms of share capital. The last area is quite easy. All the important people, not least the board, any high-level strategic partners, certainly their customers, their clients, and these institutional investors. Let's keep them on side. We know from the pre-scene that these shareholders, they're not happy. They're not happy with the financials. Yeah. Now, we do not need shareholders banging at the door asking for changes. That could mean big issues. It could also mean interest, possibly, from outside sources in terms of a possible hostile takeover. Let's be careful. Okay, just one last thing in terms of stakeholders and stakeholder management. Now, obviously, Mendelow's matrix is our go-to model. Could we get a question? I said we can. Also, look out for SYERT and March. CYERT and March, as in the month of March. They have a little theory that you're probably familiar with that I also think is quite nice, a little bit more simplistic than Mendelow's matrix and easier to use. So just to flag there, nice thing that would be easy to use, particularly some of their terminology like side payments and satisficing. So my point here is, there are actually 2 good models in the area of stakeholders. Number 1, our go-to model, Mendelow. But number 2, SYERT and March. Look them up. Handy for sure. Okay, next area for us, is in terms of analysis. In terms of analyzing the environment. Now, we've got several tools here. This is PESTEL. You'll be familiar with it. What we're talking about here is an environmental scanning tool. We know that NCTech and the board use tools and techniques, and if they don't use this one, I'll be very surprised. Now, remember what I've said about models in the exam. We're doing an analysis now, but let's just hook to the exam just for a moment. Models could come up. Be familiar with how to use models and how to analyze given information. Let me show you how. So when we think about political, note that they only operate with Farland-based clients at the moment. So the only government, or government bodies that they deal with are in Farland. So we're looking for, obviously, stability. We're certainly looking for perhaps opportunities for lobbying and indeed anyone connected with the government, regulators, etc. Outside of that, when we think of economic, again, quite straightforward. Now, when we think about this particular industry, to what extent perhaps would, let's say, a recession within Farland affect NCTech? I think it would affect it in time. The problem for clients is that when you enter into a relationship with a company of this type, you're going to be tied up in terms of a contract. So it's not going to be a question of you even being able to exit today, tomorrow, next week, or even next month. So the switching time is an issue. Okay, but certainly the economy is relevant. The only thing that works for NCTech on that basis is look at the offering that they have now. It's basic. It's the cheapest service. Yeah, it ain't PAS, it ain't SAS. So in essence, if there was a downturn, I would have thought that if these cloud service providers are affected, they're going to be affected in reverse order. SAS first, PAS, and then IAS. Okay. Global economy, relevant for the same reasons. In terms of economic areas, well, it could be anything. I mean, anything from unemployment, interest rate, exchange rates, although that's not overly relevant unless they expand. So this area would be looking out for anything in the unseen that is under these banners. Okay? Now, in terms of the social, I don't think this is overly relevant to us. You know, we know that social is all about people. Yeah, it's all about the consumer. So for me, these areas may be outside of marketing to new clients or marketing to existing clients. These are not overly important. I think this is an industry and this is a business that is needed by just about everyone. I'm not so sure if tastes, lifestyle trends, and indeed demographics are going to have a massive impact. So far, this would be the least important for me. Moving on from there, well, here's a big one. I mean, developments in tech, outside of what we see on the face of the pre-scene, there's certainly going to be more developments in this area, more developments in the cloud. Many of them relate to efficiency, speed, bandwidth, and indeed, as I've said, a lowering in costs. We also see within that area of what I've mentioned to be future CSFs, a range of different areas that don't impact right now on cloud offerings, e.g. quantum computing, e.g. AI, etc., etc. So the trend forward and what will become important for NCTech and players in this cloud services industry in the future are those areas because it's highlighted in the pre-scene. In terms of the environment, obviously we're looking for changes in law. We're conscious of the need to be a business that takes sustainability seriously. There's nothing mentioned in the pre-scene in this area. I don't see that the environment is necessarily highly important for a business like this, but nonetheless, it could be easily examined. In terms of the legal side, again, as mentioned within the pre-scene videos, any laws are relevant. Let's think back to our discussion on, Carroll and Buchholz and levels of responsibility. The bottom line is that for a company like NCTech and indeed the board, they should be a good corporate citizen. What does a good corporate citizen do? Obey the law. So when we think about Carroll and Buchholz and that sort of tiered set of responsibilities, we've got economic on the bottom, and then over and above that we've got legal, then ethical, then philanthropic. So we've got to consider where should companies like NCTech be pitching themselves. Well, certainly they need to obey the law, all law. They're a massive entity with a lot of employees, but they should be going a little bit step further. I would suggest minimum up at level 3, ethical responsibility. Okay. Let's move into Porter's 5 Forces. Now, as mentioned from the off, this is for me the most important model. Let me be clear again on what it means. Why do we use this model and why is it the best? Because Porter's 5 Forces allows us to assess the attractiveness or profitability of a given market or industry. So what we're looking to do now is just to look at each of the elements and say, well, are they strong, medium, or weak? Now, on this point, if Porter's 5 Forces is in play within the exam, your examiner, your marker, is going to want you to make a decision as to each of the forces. In other words, a decision as to, do you feel, based on the information that you have and the unseen in the question, is the force strong? Is it in the middle? Is it low? Make a decision. Don't sit on the fence. You're going to lose marks. Yeah. The other side here that I think is important is be very clear in each of the sections as to who you are talking about. When we talk about suppliers, we'll see in a moment that there are several different suppliers. When we talk about competitors, we're talking about the big boys versus the others. When we talk about substitutes, which I don't think is overly relevant to this particular company, let's be clear on what we mean by a substitute. The typical problem here, as I'll come to in a second, is that students tend to think that a substitute product for a cloud service provider is a competitor's product. No, it's not. Yeah, a substitute product under the banner of Porter's Five Forces is a product that satisfies the same need, but it is manufactured or delivered in a different way. And for me, I can't see that there is one, unless you simply don't use cloud services. Okay, so let's take a look here in terms of the first area. We're looking to consider buyer power. Firstly, who are they? Who are the buyers? Well, we see from the early part of the pre-scene that the buyers are really just about everybody. All of us in some way, shape or form are affected by the cloud and use the cloud. So we're talking about individual professionals, we're talking about the public, we're talking about medium-sized SMEs, we're talking about large businesses. So certainly increasing the force, the choice, the choice available. There's a lot of choice available for this myriad of buyers. Now, the difficulty, and again, note that I've referenced this in pre-scene video 1 and I think in 2, is the problem for not so much individuals, but the problem for businesses, and I would suggest that the bulk of their revenue comes from individuals. The problem is switching, because you've got data transfer, you've also got most cloud service providers, certainly in real life, using their own proprietary software. So the idea of extracting yourself from one and moving job lot to another, we're talking time, we're talking downtime, we're talking cost, and we're talking contractual terms. Yeah. So this is an issue for buyers. So really, based on that, I would say, broadly speaking, I think that buyer power is fairly low, notwithstanding the fact that there is choice available. In terms of supplier power, remember that under the banner of Porter's Five Forces, suppliers is anyone, whether or not it's a cleaning company, whether or not it's a caterers, whether or not it's employees, it's anyone supplying anything to this company. So there are a variety, and obviously some will be critical, and some will not. I would have thought the critical ones would be ones linked into the whole area of IT and IS and their service, their core competence. In terms of the ones that aren't critical, clearly, if it's low-level stuff, we could easily switch. Some will be by the by, not overly important at all. So based on that, for my money, is sort of in the middle. It depends who the supplier is. Now, competitors or competition, we have large competitors, both in the Farland marketplace and in this market. Now, I've said it's mature. I wonder whether or not I should have said this. We're talking about an industry or a market that's been around for more than 10 years. You might say it's mature right now. There's a question mark there. But certainly, bottom line is that increasing the power of competition are the large number, and the fact that this market is pretty well established. In terms of decreasing the force, albeit for the fact they're not one of the big boys, they're not in a bad position. Look at the revenues, and they've focused in on a nice cushy little business model, i.e. basic, low cost. There must be a variety of customers of NCTech who use them because of pricing. They cannot afford or do not want to afford to use PAS or SAS, so they focus in on one of the niche players like NCTech and an area that is fairly cost efficient, with costs likely to come down over time. So for me, this area is certainly high in terms of force. In terms of new entrants, for me, I think low. I think low, notwithstanding the fact that, you might say that when we look at the financials for these cloud service providers, we're going to see some profit, but it's tricky. Look at the financials for NCTech. And again, there are 10, I think it's mentioned in the pre-scene, big players, both globally and indeed in foreign, ahead of them. Yeah. So to get into this market as a new player, because that's what new entrants mean, a new player. Yeah. I don't think it's impossible, but it's a big call. Yeah. Outside of that, when we look at substitutes, for me, I don't really see that there is an exact substitute for the service that they offer, unless perhaps you simply don't use it. And I think if companies, SMEs, etc., or indeed individuals have been using cloud service, the idea that they would cut it off at some point seems, I just can't see that happening. Okay, so bottom line is, broadly speaking, medium to high, couple of lows, low profitability. That's what I think. Okay, so next area, SWOT. This is quite important. Now, in my experience of dealing with case study exams, very often the questions on the day link in some way, shape or form to the SWOT analysis. I mean, they sort of have to, because you remember what I said about the SWOT. It's about what's good and bad now and what may be good and bad in the future. So in terms of strengths, this is a listed company with a good reputation and great prestige. They have a nice market position. They're not the market leader. Over and above that, really, this is an assumption, but they have good relationships with their clients and with the myriad of other stakeholders. They're known for their quality and they're reasonably big. These are strengths. In terms of the weaknesses, unfortunately, I think the weaknesses probably outweigh the strengths. The financials are weak in a number of different areas. I'd refer you to pre-scene video 3 in this respect. He's flagged the GP several times and we've talked about it. Why? We're not sure. The margins are falling. ROCE is falling. These are issues. Outside of that, I'm very concerned about staff. It's mentioned they are walking out the door. This business is all about staff. It's all about the know-how and expertise of staff. You've also got to be thinking about succession. Not just broadly speaking in terms of management staff, but also the board. They say within the pre-scene that the board structure hasn't changed for 5 years. That's a fairly long time and might give us some CG returns, but the bottom line is that things will change over time. You need to be looking at who's going to replace who. In terms of the CSR area, I put this as a weakness only because I wanted to flag it to you. I don't see any reference to it in any way, shape or form broadly within the pre-scene. I'll say that's a weakness. Let's flag it and let's make sure that we're aware of the two main arguments as discussed earlier on. The other key point is clearly customers or clients of NCTech are using them mainly because of price. They like the quality, they like the reliability, but if they up their prices, they might be walking out the door. And based on the financials as we see, something's going on because revenues are falling and indeed GP, that's not linked strictly speaking into customers. Maybe they're buying cheaper systems or whatever. Maybe the GP on some of their ranges are a little bit lower. But the bottom line is that I would have thought that the main thing that draws customers and clients to NCTech is the fact the service is good, but the price is right. Moving on to opportunities, quite a few. Now, I've mentioned Ansoff a number of times. I'm not going to go through that again. Developing countries, absolutely subject to the area that we flagged, i.e. infrastructure and indeed internet. And I'd link that into Porter's Diamond. Remember what I said in pre-scene video 1? I talked about Fockers, if you remember. In terms of the tech developments, we've been through that several times. Note, we're talking about something outside of PAS and SAS. They've been around for years. So let's look to that area of future CSFs. So we're talking about AI, we're talking about quantum computing, etc. And maybe just read on Google outside of information with the pre-scene and draw your attention to our industry analysis as well. I've flagged this area of an alliance or an acquisition or a joint venture. It stands to reason that he could examine this possibly on the lines of maybe suitability, acceptability, and feasibility, possibly on the lines of, benefits and risks associated with a JV with such and such partner in such and such area. And obviously international, I'm talking about broadly moving abroad, the new markets, and all the myriad of pluses and minuses associated with that. I might even link that into the whole change management area, which we know is a nice little SBL topic. Okay, in terms of the threats, quite a few. If I was to look down this list here, I'd probably pick out, from my knowledge of the SBL exam, number 3, for reasons that we've already discussed, and indeed any form of risk. Remember, as I've said when we touched on, I think in pre-scene video 1, I said, if we aren't able to define and wheel out the 12 or 13 or 15 different types of risk that any company would experience or be faced with, then we're crazy. That's got to be a go-to question, one that he's used, if you look back over the SBL exams, several times. Outline the risks associated with the information that I've just given you. Easy peasy. Okay, let's move on from here. So in essence, we've looked at tools, we've looked at techniques, and we're trying to come up with some ideas as to where they're going to go from here. Now where they're going to go from here has to be linked into the whole area of advantage, or indeed maintaining or creating competitive advantage. They've managed to do that so far, but how are they going to do that going forward? Now we know under this banner of generic strategies that, there's 3, if 4 key options. We know that what Porter says is that really this area of leadership is about being the lowest cost producer. Now let's be careful here, because the mistake that students make here when they talk about cost leadership is they talk about price. It's not about price, or not directly linked to price. What cost leadership means is lowest cost producer. Now, I'm talking economies of scale, spreading fixed costs, units, volume, etc., etc. Now, it may well be that if you have a given supplier of XYZ, it may well be that being the lowest cost producer links well with the lowest price, but it doesn't have to be that way. So just be careful of that mistake. That mistake is made quite a lot. Okay, so there's an option, question mark. I'm not sure if I'm going to apply that or not. What about differentiation? Well, differentiation means obviously being different. So we're talking about uniqueness. We're talking about premium price. We're talking about high quality. We're talking about high service. So, question, is that what we think that NCTech do? Come back to that in a moment. Now, next area here, next 2 areas here is where we look at focus. Let's deal with focus first. What do we mean? Well, we're really talking about niching. We're talking about looking at a segment of the market and focusing in, tying in just to that segment because it suits us. So note that this is narrow focus. This is whole market or broad focus. And focus is broken down into 2. Let's get that segment and let's focus on being the lowest cost producer in that particular segment. Or let's go the reverse. Let's do differentiation in that segment. So you have a choice, okay? Now, based on what we see on screen, what would we suggest that NCTech are doing, have done, and indeed could do? Well, for me, and there's a certain amount of guesswork required, for me it has to be differentiation. That's the feel I get. I mean, you've got 3 founders, 3 entrepreneurs, 3 experts in this field. Within 10 years, they've built a business that's on the face of it very, very profitable, and indeed they've managed to list. I mean, that is fast. This is a business that was broadly a first mover, probably with one or two others, that has grown rapidly. And for me, the way to grow rapidly and indeed to build big revenues and big profits is to differentiate yourself. There's nothing in the pre-scene that lends itself to cost cutting or being the lowest cost producer or shaving. Nothing at all. Everything, broadly speaking, although it's subtle, lends itself to we're different. Our RIS products or service is different. We'll give you exactly what you want. So for me, that's where we're going to pitch it. Let's move on to our next area. Just very briefly, stuck in the middle. I don't think that's overly relevant to a company like NCTech in the cloud services industry, the idea that would be a little bit of everything. But in effect, what Porter says is, don't try and do everything. Pick one. Okay. Let's move on from there into our Ansoff's matrix. Now, this is probably the model that I've discussed most often across each of the 4 videos, and probably for good reason, as I've said. We know that it's all based on really sort of markets and products. For products, I guess we're reading the IAS product, yeah, and indeed existing versus new. And as I've said several times, as we move, yeah, around the grid, we would start here, because Ansoff is basically saying you've got several options. I mean, you can do all of them if you want, or you can do a couple of them. But he's saying if we were to start here, if we were to focus on the existing market, then we're talking about Farland. Yeah? If we were to focus on the existing product, we're talking about IAS. So let's just say that we're in a board meeting, yeah, at NCTech, and indeed we're talking about expansion, because Ansoff's matrix is a product or stroke service expansion grid. Yeah, it's discussed as to how we expand. What does that mean? Well, market penetration in terms of expansion means more of the same. It means gain more market share by doing what you've been doing in the existing market of Farland with the existing product, IAS. Okay? That's what market penetration means. And in essence, that has to be the least risky, yeah? Because that's how they've grown, yeah? Now, whether or not that's been organic or indeed through expansion, it doesn't really matter. But the bottom line is safe, okay? Now, when we move from there, yeah, next, least risky, as it were, is going to be market development. And again, I flagged this several times. I'd be very surprised if this isn't at least mentioned in some way, somehow, within the unseen on the day. So we're talking about the world. I mean, look at the size, yeah, of the cloud service market globally. Yeah, we're talking about, I think, $155 billion. I mean, it's humongous. It's humongous compared to the turnover of NCTech. So this is an obvious idea to move in to the right type of company. Now, just remind you about Porter's Diamond, think Fockers, yeah? Remember that if we're going to be moving into a new market, we're looking at the right sort of market. We need a market with good infrastructure. Obvious example is internet, yeah? But we also need savvy consumers. We need sophisticated consumers. We need sophisticated businesses. We need a thriving business community. We need companies that are going to grow over the time and possibly take on the new services that we offer, the new products, maybe PAS, etc., etc. As we move up the grid towards product development, and again, I've just touched on that, but there's a range of options here. And when we think about product development and indeed the whole area of R&D, we know, as we've seen from all areas of tech, take mobile phones as an example. The cost of mobile phones in the 1980s and indeed early 1990s when I got my first one is an arm and a leg. You get a phone for just about nothing now. It's going to be the same within cloud services. The costs of each of the 3 existing offerings, and this is leaving aside possible other avenues or other new services, is going to come down. So clients are going to go for that. And that's one of the things, certainly, that the NCTech board need to be thinking about. What are the new service? Are they investing in it? Do they have the money to? Last area here, for me, as I've said, I don't like the idea of diversification within case studies because this is high risk. And when we go from penetration to market development to product development, for me, those are the main three ones. Now, does this mean this would never, ever be in play in the SBL exam? No. But the bottom line is tricky, yeah? Because when we think about diversification, we're talking about a completely new market and a completely new product or service. We have, broadly speaking, I know we can split it between related and unrelated, but broadly speaking, we've no expertise, no experience, no competence. You know, for a case study exam, for most businesses, this would be a no-no. Okay, right, let's move into this area of methods of growth. Now, I've touched on this. We don't know a hell of a lot of information about how they have grown, but I would suggest to you it's a combination of the first two. It has to be, you know, internal development, just doing what they do well. Okay, you know, the services, and indeed I would suggest to you under the IS banner that there's not just one option, there's a range of different options for customers under that banner. So the bottom line is developing organically or internally is clearly an idea. Yeah. In terms of the cost cutting, obviously the cheaper the costs are, the cheaper the price is more than likely, the more efficient they are, the more clients we're going to get. Now, but that isn't it. Acquisition is a big area. And in terms of, you know, acquiring other companies, I would have thought, given what we know about the basic offering, that if they were going to acquire a target, acquiring a target that's niching into perhaps PAS or SS would be something that they would definitely consider. Absolutely. Maybe a smaller company, notwithstanding the financial problems that they have. Okay. In terms of JV, we might also mention strategic alliance. You know, this would again give them the option and probably be more cost effective than an outright purchase of a smaller supplier or indeed any form of acquisition. The bottom line is that we could pool resources, expertise with another and create some sort of brand. So there's an option for us. Think also, as I said, strategic alliance. In terms of divesting, I don't think this is overly relevant. The only question that is begging, as it were, is what's going on in the financials. You know, is it that, you know, we've got some part of our service, some part of our sort of product line that is underperforming? I mean, something's happening in the relationship between sales and cost of services and obviously gross profit. We've got to find out what it is. It's got to be relevant to some aspect of what we sell. So, you know, I would be surprised if there isn't some reference to that on the big day. Okay? Right. In terms of defining business strategy, well, you know, we're not asked to be experts in the cloud services industry. We're not asked to arrive on exam day and have a blueprint for success for NCTech for the future. But it's helpful to be able to consider it. Yeah. So really, we've covered within this strategic analysis a variety of different areas that would form part of a future strategy, whether or not that's a new service, whether or not that's a new market, whether or not that's one of the areas within the future CSFs, i.e. business intelligence or quantum computing, AI, etc. So we've covered this area. The other thing that I would mention here, again, I've said this several times, in terms of dealing with questions that ask you to comment on strategy, remember, again, there is no one answer to a case study question. As long as you are logical, yeah, as long as your argument isn't crazy or out in left field, you're going to get marks. I think it's difficult for students when they read model solutions, particularly on the SBL paper, and they think, is this what I have to write? No, it's not. Not at all. Not even a prize winner is going to write a model solution as shown or as published by the ACCA. Absolutely not. We're going to write answers that are well structured, that answer the question, that show skills, that broadly speaking are based on a reasonable knowledge of the areas within the SBL syllabus and some good common sense. that's what we're going to do. So if you have to make a decision, a recommendation, back yourself, as you would in the office, and make that decision and justify it. Okay. In terms of strategies going forward, these are just ideas based on what I've said. Obviously, markets and customers, we need more. We know what the critical success factors are. We certainly wouldn't be moving away, in any massive way from the existing strategy. It's been successful, notwithstanding the recent financial problems. We may well look to expand, diversify, not so sure, but we would be expanding in these areas, okay? Outside of that, let's keep an eye on our relations in this whole area of stakeholders, not just with the public, but also key contacts and indeed other stakeholders, okay? So, there we have it, a strategic analysis for NCTech. I hope that you found that helpful. Some areas certainly more important than others, but certainly if I was you, what I'd be doing is just make some notes on what made sense. If anything didn't make sense, then look it up, whether or not that's the balanced scorecard or possibly Porter's 5 forces or perhaps elements of Ansoff's matrix in terms of the terminology. Bottom line is as you go from video to video, build your set of notes and then, as mentioned, use this information within your mock exams. The key to becoming more informed with a company like this is to start practicing, so don't avoid that. Okay, so listen, thank you for listening. I hope that your studies are going well. I wish you good luck in the exam. Cheers.
So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, I hope you have found it useful. If you did enjoy this video and you want to see more of it, then please do visit our website www.astranti.com. We have a free ACCA SBL pre-scene pack that includes all 3 videos for the pre-scene analysis, the strategic analysis, and the top 10 pre-scene issues. In addition to that, we also have our industry analysis document and 2 ACCA SBL mock exams with complete solutions for you to practice ahead of the exam. And also, you have access to our SBL discussion board, so you and fellow students like yourself in the same position studying for this exam will be able to chat, will be able to ask questions and receive answers from our tutors. And the best part is all of this is completely free. In order to access this, please click the link in the description or visit the website www.astranti.com and sign up for our free ACCA SBL resources now. So thank you again for watching this video, and do check out that website for more free content.